Okay, Vector, I think this may be the first time you've been on my stream. I don't know. It's been a while since I've done one, so I don't remember. If you have, I apologize. Go ahead. What's your thoughts? Did you see the debate? What were your, if you did, what were your thoughts? What do you think the best back and forth? Who do you think won? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Old Earth creationist here, theistic evolution. And so obviously I don't support the effort. Unfortunately, as much as I love SFT and his heart and what he's trying to present, I'm Old Earth. And I've seen enough of these debates and honestly, for me, it just comes down to young Earth creationism has too many ad hoc explanations. I'm going to go with science on this one.
Well, I remember talking to you for hours about ERVs and chromosomes.
No, it wasn't hours, but we did talk about it.
Oh no, it was.
Yeah, we talked about speciation. Okay, well,
what I'll say is, from my experience, it's actually the theistic evolutionists who have the ad hoc, post hoc explanations. Because it has been a few months. So, have you found a paper yet showing non-functional endogenous retroviruses going from non-functional to functional?
No, and you know what? I appreciate.
Okay, so it looks like you're the ones with the post hoc, ad hoc explanations. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the depth to which all of you guys have researched it, and it's one of the reasons. I use a lot of the arguments from, the improbability of abiogenesis when I approach non-theists. But I know you explained it to me, and you'd probably do it again. But to me, like speciation in 6,000 years, unless physics has changed, I don't believe it's possible.
Well, we see rapid speciation events today, so it's really not a problem. As a matter of fact, it's a problem for the deep time evolutionists why there's not more species. Why is there only 10 to 18,000 bird species, for example? Why are there so few mammal species? So it's actually an issue for the old Earth creationists, not the young Earth creationists.
I look at it almost if you think about historical progress as it relates to the hard sciences. The way I look at it, God created a perfect world and he created a possibility space for human beings to exist. And I think just like like in theology, how it kind of progresses towards where you get to the Messiah, which is the culmination. In the same way, God has used processes beyond our finite minds to bring about this possibility space. I don't think looking at the data, because it's a stochastic process, right? We could start talking about Shannon information, stochastic processes. That's why I don't think abiogenesis by itself can do it. But I just don't think, and when I like to study time, A theory and B theory and the nature of time. And I have, have a fairly, well, I'll just say a loose grasp on radioactive decay. But I don't think the time frame and the number of species and your geographical location problems, I don't think you can come up with a scenario that's going to convince me logically. And that's just where I stand. I almost wish that I could have a logical foundation to go young Earth creation. But
here's the thing is, and I appreciate your points, but we do have a logical foundation. And when it comes to the speciation, like I said, the question is why aren't there more species? Because we know based on epigenetic changes, okay, we have millions and millions of genetic switches just waiting to be turned on via environmental change. So we have new species of birds, for example, that we're observing before our very own eyes on islands like the Galapagos Islands that we're actually there studying and observing. We're not observing every last inch of this planet. So if we're seeing new species form today, the question is, why are there so few species? The number of species today that we see actually is in line perfectly with 4,500 years since the flood. Here's another one, a new species of finch on Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands seem to evolve through. But what's funny is what we're seeing with these speciation events, they're typically due to what's called shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. So we're seeing adaptive changes, new species, as a result of a reduction in allelic variability. So this makes sense. Take species back thousands of years ago where they had more allelic potential, more levels of heterozygosity, you'd have faster speciation events. So today we have less genetic information and heterozygosity for speciation events, and yet we're still seeing it in real time. Go back thousands of years ago, speciation events would have been even faster. So my question to you then, if we're seeing new species in real time, go back, let's say 300 million years to theropod-like dinosaurs and the origin of birds according to the evolutionary model. Why aren't there millions of species of birds? Why only roughly 10,000 to 18,000? We see new species form today. So really that makes sense in 4,500 years, but 300 million years? Yeah, I'd be curious. How do you account for the low numbers of species? Go ahead.
Okay, well, let's make our assumption that the laws of physics and everything are exactly the same as they are now. And so we have a 6,000 year time period. So all we see currently, and I agree with you on this, we see structural changes, small structural changes in color or size and shape of, organs, or the way that these organisms express themselves to the environment. But I think now we've reached kind of a, well, anyways, it's the whole paradigm. For me, chromosome 2.
Well, wait a minute. Stop. Hey, don't slap and
Yeah.
run. Don't slap and run.
Okay,
Answer
go
the
ahead.
question. Why, if we're seeing new bird species today form, and
Right.
yet we only have roughly 10 to 18,000 bird species, we can look at lizards. I'm actually just going with bird species because that's one of the most the species that we see. Everything else, I mean, lizard species, we've only got about 4,600, snake species 3,600, rabbit species 29, bats, easily explainable in 4,500 years. Now, even with bird species where we see
Stop right there. I reject that previous statement. Easily explainable in 4,500 years.
Yes,
No.
because we see new species form today. So if we're seeing new species form today, it clearly doesn't take thousands to millions of years for new species to form. So my question to you, and I'll ask you for the third time, how do you account for such few species? Focus on birds if you want. Why are there such few species if apparently birds go back 300 million years to theropod-like dinosaurs? We should be seeing millions of species, not just thousands. So yeah, go ahead. How do you answer that?
Okay, well, that's easy to answer. So I'm a theistic evolutionist. I'm a Christian idealist, kind of a la IP. So my answer to that would be that I don't accept. Okay, let me premise this. Okay, I think God's infinite, and guess what? He could have poofed this into existence from a possible world through string theory in some way that we can only imagine. And if that's the hypothesis, I'm going to say,
why such few species? Please just answer the question.
Okay, so as far as speciation, okay,
you're the one who brought up speciation. So why such few species?
And it's actually a problem for your model as well.
No, I'm showing you that it's not a problem for my model. I've got.
I'm saying it's a problem for your model.
Got the numbers of species in front of you. Is my screen shared? Why are there such few bird species? Go ahead.
Okay. So far, I mean, we know the process of evolution. We know what alleles are. We know how it affects populations in the wild.
What's an allele?
So,
what's your definition of an allele?
I'm not a biologist. I mean,
well, you said we know what alleles are, so clearly you don't.
Yeah, my background is engineering and philosophy of mind, stuff like that. So I don't. To me, I'm going to let you guys do the hard work of understanding the specifics of the genetics.
You're the one that came in though, and you were slapping and running. You said speciation's a problem.
Okay, well, I'll give you my
form in real time. Go ahead. Yeah. Well, what's your answer?
Yeah, I understand your question. Let me give you my answer. Okay, my answer is that since I believe that evolution is the means rather than fiat ex nihilo, that I think God brought the whole cosmos ex nihilo, but I think that it's possible that we just interpret the Bible differently.
Yeah, but you still haven't answered the question.
It's impossible.
Is why are there such few? You came in here and said that the young Earth creation model has a speciation problem. There's too many species.
I gave you my
I'm
answer.
actually showing you that there's too few species for your model. If birds go back 300 million years to theropod-like dinosaurs, and yet we're seeing new bird species form today, okay? Why are there only thousands of species and not millions of species? Please, just for the fifth time,
easy.
Just either say you don't have an answer or provide an answer. Go ahead.
My answer would be simply that because of the way that individual organisms, model their environment, they reach a point, the Earth as a whole reaches a kind of a point of synchronization, syncretism and synchronization, where the speciation slows down, and say like a tiger, because it's so well designed for its environment, isn't going to evolve, into anything different. And because all you're witnessing is that structural evolution and color change, stuff like that. You don't have enough time to create all the species. That would be my argument. I mean, you can dispute it, but it's
disputed by the data.
I mean,
Well, I'll say this one point and then I'll yield. So we can actually do genetic sequencing. We can see, for example, when it comes to the bird species, we can see how these species are forming. And as I pointed out, they're forming due to a loss in allelic variability. Okay, these species are going from shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. Okay, so they're adapting, but it's not due to an increase in genetic complexity. It's not due to an increase in genetic information. There's no new body plans being added. There's not an increase in phenotypic complexity. That's what would be needed for large scale evolution, which you're proposing. No, we see that the data is consistent with thousands of years ago, God would have created these archetypes. Okay, with pre-existing genetic information and a front-loaded capacity to change. As time goes on and we see more and more change, we see a reduction in the ability to change and speciate and adapt. So the point is, we see new species. I hear some background noise if someone wants to mute. So the point is, we see new species form today. It's not due to vertical changes. It's no help to large-scale evolution, but it's exactly what young Earth creationists would predict. And we've got the numbers, we've got the predictions, and we can look at felids, we can look at canids, we can look at mammals, reptiles, aquatic species. It's all in line with roughly 4,500 years since the flood. We also got that massive barcoding study where over 90% of species originated at exactly the same time due to the levels of genetic diversity in the CO1 gene. Okay, that's more proof of the flood bottleneck. So no, there's no problem with our model. And my point is the problem exists in the evolutionary model in that there's too few species. Go ahead, I yield.
I'll let him respond first, and then I'll go ahead and I'll talk about mine.
Okay. Again, and we're just going to agree to disagree. Is I don't think the time frame is sufficient to create the changes that you're talking about. Say, like for instance, from a snow leopard and some other type of cat-like creature in the Amazon jungle or something. There's not enough time for the structural evolution and the way that it processes the genetic information to create those structural variations, in kinds that you're talking about. So yeah, I just think it's a matter of time. That's why I go with yom as an age rather than a day. Simple as that.
Except you haven't actually answered the problem with your model as to how there's such few species. The changes you're talking about are already within the genetics of living organisms. Okay, there's the capacity for those adaptations. There's no increase in genetic complexity that's necessary for those types of adaptive episodes. We can get these changes through epigenetics. We can get those changes through what we're seeing in the finches, shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. This is all in line with the model of created genetic diversity. But with your model needs an increase in genetic complexity. You need to explain the origin of phenotypic complexity. That's not the type of changes we are seeing. And that's why we as young Earth creationists were able to make testable predictions based on speciation events. Theistic evolutionists cannot. Yeah, go ahead, Ayil.
Okay, well, I'm going to put it in analogical form because a lot of people listening may not, they may understand the words vaguely and the concepts, but let's put it in terms of an analogy. Okay, so let's take it from the earliest human history where we actually have historical knowledge of what species exist and what they look like, etc. Like we know that probably crocodiles and hippopotamuses were in the ecosystem, at the time of the earliest historical writings that we have. Would you accept that?
Repeat that question.
We have historical documentation of what types of species existed in reality from the earliest that we can trace back to human beings, which we're going to go with 6,000 years in your model. So,
right, we can see certain felid species in Egyptian records, for example, and we can see depictions. Okay,
but you're missing my point. You're missing my point. So, say like an animal like a hippopotamus or a crocodile, so that's so perfectly designed for their environment, they're not going to evolve, towards something that's the reason that, and this discussion could take hours, but so that's just my short analogy of why if you observe the changes that we see in that 6,000 year time frame that we have available to us, we don't see enough structural changes going on now And I don't know, maybe you can explain that to me genetically. And then
I'll share my screen, John, and this will be the last thing I'll say. I don't want to dominate the whole time. So the thing is, I've got a number of papers here that refutes exactly what you're saying, okay? Animals are evolving faster than you think. Here's the living proof. Is rapid evolution common in plant species? These findings suggest that rapid evolution could be remarkably common in introduced plant species. We've got paper after paper showing that, here's a great one too, epigenetic variation, okay, which can happen simply through environmental change, environmental cue. We can see epigenetic variation may contribute to the phenotypic diversity of Darwin's finch populations. So point is, we can see just through even epigenetic changes, through the other changes that I talked about, rapid adaptive episodes. Okay, we see certain fish species, they enter a cold water and all of a sudden, boom, they evolve an adaptation that prior evolutionary thinking was this would take thousands to millions of years. So no, the data, the secular literature refutes what we're saying, is that we can see, look at here, more and more evolution is showing that rapid evolution can occur in as little as 10 to 100 years. Now remember, when they say rapid evolution, when you actually look, because we should always look to the genotype, what are these changes? We can look to the phenotype, okay, but these adaptive episodes, what are they the result of? Well, when we look to the genotype, we see that they're a result of a reduction in genetic variability, a reduction in genetic information. So that's not going to take your fish to fisherman. So yeah, we see adaptive episodes, but it's perfectly in line with the young earth creation model of created heterozygosity, which just means a state of DNA diversity. So no, everything you're saying is actually refuted by the secular literature. It just shows, unfortunately, that you're not up to date with the data. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, this will actually make it clearer to everybody, perhaps. Okay, so basically what you're doing is you're taking information from a scientific model that doesn't agree with what you're saying. So the data that they're presenting, saying it's faster than we thought, yeah, that's faster compared to the long time frames that they propose.
Exactly. So it can happen quickly, which we're
no. That's what I'm saying. You're taking a quote, or you're taking an abstract from a paper, or you're taking some other information from a model that the data in that model is based on those long time frames. So if you take it out of that context and then try to quote and say it's happening fast, because they said, yeah, faster than they thought, for whatever reasons they're going to give us. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and that data refutes exactly what you're saying, is because we can see that change can happen rapidly. So we don't need millions of years. We know that epigenetics can lead to rapid adaptive episodes. We see new species form in real time. I've shown you a couple papers on that when it comes to the finch species. So this whole argument that there's too many species to explain in just 4,500 years has actually been completely dismantled, and it has led PhD young earth creationists, for example, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has a PhD from Harvard, and he's written numerous technical papers that I recommend you read with a very, very well laid out model on speciation and speciation events since the flood. So no, this has all been looked at, and this argument about speciation has been thoroughly addressed and refuted. And based on what we now know about rapid change, it's actually a problem for the deep time proponents, because the question again is, why are there so few species? Why aren't there more species if deep time evolution is true? And I yield. Go ahead.
Yeah, you did. If you can address for me just this simple question, okay, if like say humans and all of their species are finally adapted to their environments, you know, to that extremely high level, to where these changes now that we can observe is just finches or colors of a moth or whatever other data that you want to present. You're talking about just color changes, you know, like skin color changes that are happening in 6,000 years, you know, might change a little bit. I think they're saying, well, it doesn't matter, because I just believe a different model than you.
Oh,
wait,
don't stop it. You said if only I could explain. You said if only I can explain, but then you never said what I need to explain. Well, what is it? It seems like you're all over the place. What do I need to explain that I haven't yet explained?
Okay, so first of all, you haven't addressed the question of how the species remain intact that we have historical references for in terms of their total, you know, genetic makeup. I subtract that in terms of their physical qualities that were described to us you know, like say we know that the lions that 6,000 years ago that were possibly taken on the ark, I believe in a local flood. So I just have a different paradigm view of reality.
Okay, but you still haven't actually presented an argument or answered any questions. The changes we see, for example,
actually, those are arguments.
No, there isn't. You're just slapping and running all over the place. Okay, so if you look at my slide that I have here, if you look to an ark archetype, okay, and you look to the changes that would be necessary to produce your cheetahs, your lions, all your different 37 felid species, okay, all of those changes do not require an increase in phenotypic complexity. It does not require anatomical changes. Okay, yeah, we see morphological changes, we see shifts in gene frequency. What we actually see is the result of the front-loaded capacity for that change. But when it comes to the evolutionary model, to take a single-celled like organism into a whale, that requires the opposite. That requires an increase in genetic complexity. That requires an increase in net genetic information. No, what we see is reduction for the most part and adaptive episodes due to epigenetic changes. This is what we see. It's all throughout the literature. There's not a problem going from a horse archetype to all the different horse species we see today, for example, in this diagram. Not a problem going from a bear archetype to all the different bear species we see today. None of these changes require the large scale type of innovations that large scale evolution requires. I think you understand what I'm saying. The point is, no, it's not a problem for the young earth creation model. We've looked at this and it's actually resulted in testable predictions. So go ahead, I yield.
Yeah, you haven't really addressed okay, well, why all the species that we have, most of the known species that were known to ancient history that we have a record of historically that we can scientifically support.
What, hippos and crocodiles and lions and tigers? What about them? It's not a problem for our model. I don't understand what your argument is. None of that requires large scale changes.
Okay, if the lions go, hey, LP, why don't you jump in? I think I've gone as far as I can go.
Well, I think that Matt's actually been being very quiet for a while. I think you had something you want to say, right, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to ask him a quick question regarding a couple things, because I mean, I understand he's an old Earth creationist, and you know, I mean, I don't want to go into too much with the ERVs, but somebody else is also talking in the comment section about ERVs, which I'd like to go over that a little bit later.
Well, that's why pigs can fly. That's why I asked him, because we talked about it before, and he said ERVs are a problem. And I pointed out, and I showed him a dozen papers about how we are now finding incredibly important and essential functions in these transposable elements. So I asked him to explain how that's possible. Well, in an evolutionary model, and he has yet to provide a paper showing the co-option of these incredibly important functions. So no, the evidence best explains these ERVs as being created units of DNA function and not the ancient remnants of past viral infections. And Vector has failed to explain the data.
Well, ERVs. the other thing with the retroviruses is that the way that viruses function in the first place, and again, we were supposed to, if we are believing that God created all things, he would have created them for a different purpose than to degrade or cause any kind of problem for us. So that's something that would have developed over time. But the real issue is that these ERVs, they have to be able to function in a very specific way. So they would only be able to affect a very specific small portion of your DNA for the purpose that they were designed to enhance or whatever would it be. And in this case, if you have a certain amount of similarity to any other biomolecular structure, those would of course only be able to affect the ones that have that similarity. That's it. So whenever we see that there are similar, like there's a specific spot where they say, okay, this is where this ERV had an effect on this this creature, and therefore we believe that it was descended or an ancestor to another creature, they're miscorrelating this, not understanding that it's possible that because their genetic code was similar, they both could have gotten the exact same spot affected. It only affects that. That's its job is to affect only that portion of DNA, right? That's the whole point. So,
well, here's the thing, pigs, is if these retroviral-like elements are actually created units of DNA function, right? They were front-loaded into the original genetic kinds, which the evidence seems to suggest. Then that means the reason why we have similar retroviral-like elements in humans and chimpanzees is because they're there for functional purposes. For example, functions in embryological development, immune response, cell stress responses. So it doesn't have to be the result of past viral infections. It could be they were put there that way for functional purposes.
Right. I mean, there are multiple ways of looking at it. I'm just letting you know this is the way it came across to me. And I mean, I've done some study on microbiology a little bit because I was I had to do atmospheric monitoring on my submarine when I was working in the sub.
Right.
And so I had to know quite a bit about stuff like that too. But I mean, just thinking about it from that perspective, if there's any similarity, right? And again, these viruses only affect a specific portion of the DNA or RNA strand, whatever. It obviously is going to affect all species that it's able to come into contact with, right? So it's like, why would you ever assume that this means that they were descendant of each other? That doesn't make any sense.
Well,
like,
especially
hop in on that one sec?
Especially if they're functional. Like right here, I'll say this and then I'll yield. Retroviral promoters in the human genome, endogenous retroviral RNAs involved in immunity. I mean, paper after paper showing the, even right here, scientists identify new beneficial function of endogenous retroviruses in immune response. So yeah, if we have functional DNA elements such as endogenous retroviruses or ALU sequences in, say, chimpanzees and humans,
yes.
Well, now that we see that these DNA elements are important for so many reasons and those functions could never have evolved, that's why no evolutionist can show you data, empirical data, showing a non-functional ERV going from non-functional to functional. That suggests that what we're looking at here are created units of DNA function. So the reason why we have similar DNA elements with the chimpanzees is because they're there for functional purposes, which points us back to what? A common designer, right?
Right. And anyway, to me, it almost seems like these ERVs are actually genes that were somehow separated from the original genome, and they're just acting on their own as like a
rogue element almost. Kind of thing.
Yeah, like a rogue element. Yeah.
Can I interject on that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
I just want to say that, so you're familiar with the three theories, the Bible aside, the three secular theories as to how viruses started in the first place, because they're not necessarily alive all that much.
I don't know
one of which,
but if you want to do a quick rundown.
I was just pointing out, so the one that makes the most sense to me is the escape theory, is instead of human DNA having ERVs as an infection of that human DNA, the reason why there's a correlation is that it seems that the origin of viruses themselves is exactly what you were talking about, is that it could be functional pieces of the genome that at some point during, I'm not going to be able to explain it very well, but at some point during replication, those pieces will go from one part of the genome to the other. It's part of the original organisms, not just humans, but original organisms' DNA. If that happens to escape and stay together, then that could be the origin of a virus. A piece of that thing's DNA escaping
Right. So it's basically just a portion of DNA that managed to somehow get away from the original cell that it was the membrane, right? That it was
right.
Okay.
And I think that's why right here, the VIGE, that stands for variation inducing genetic element hypothesis, it would actually predict, and it has predicted function for these viral-like elements. And that's actually what we've discovered over and over again. So that's why I think this is the best model, which has to do with what you're saying, where certain mobile retrovirus particles originally could have moved from site to site within the genome, thereby changing the way genes are regulated within the host genome. And I think that it had to be that way because right here, I think that this is important, something the evolutionists can't answer, is that certain genes, right here, retroviruses could have originated from within the host genome instead of invading it from outside. This had to have been the case in any scenario, since viruses are dependent upon host cells, right? This means that the cell's genome had to predate viruses if viruses are incapable of surviving without a host cell. So I'd love Vector to explain how these retroviruses could have originated without the host.
There is one possibility.
All right. Hang on, guys. Before we go down this rabbit hole some more, we're gonna have some fun. So, Praise, thank you so much for the $5 super chat. He says, "Wasn't there a kind of koala on the Ark, not a specific species?" Which I would say is a good observation there from the positions being put forth. But then Caleb had a good little comeback And he says, thank you also for the $5 super chat. Was there a praise species on the ark or the result of evolution? And I'm going to go with Caleb. Caleb, I think that praise may be proof that Darwin was correct. I mean, and we're just all wrong. It's well, Vector would be correct in this context, and I think Morio, you kind of lean old Earth, right? But you're kind of open to.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think that the world can be as early as it needs to be, and that I think that Adam was specifically a unique creation. I think that there could have been a lot of individually unique creations that have speciated since then, and that Adam was specifically 6,000 years ago. I think that there was a literal flood of some sort, although I think there's a more localized flood, there's a completely universal flood that could have reset a lot of those things, which would account for exactly what you guys have been talking about as far as how few species there are. If Noah saved enough of the kinds of animals, but not necessarily every individual unique species that could have evolved over that period of time from the original however many types there were, that we've had about 4,500 years of speciation since then.
Right. Well, I think something that often gets left out of, and I know SFT was kind of alluding to this, but one of the things that kind of gets left out from a very blunt perspective is, if speciation isn't requiring all these pressures as well as a growth of data in the genome in order to actually occur. If you're flipping the script and saying that there used to be exponentially more available configurable data in the genome in the past, then the rate of which the speciation would occur by default would be exponentially faster as well. And since you're not having to wait for new information to arise, you already have it. The second those pressures would be experienced by the organisms, then the speciation events and the adaptations be happening immediately rather than with a time delay. And this is why kind of the point I was making earlier in relation to the in the past there was this function was obviously there. Now the descendants of down the line have lost this. So they had it in the past, they don't have it now. What does this tell you? We're losing data, which continues to support the point that I was making. But
exactly,
that's one of my thoughts on that.
It's a great point.
Yeah, that book by Dr. John Sanford regarding genetic entropy is extremely informational regarding this. I mean, I think that once people realize just how much the genome of every animal is, including humans, if you want to count them as animals, is degrading, that will be a huge eye-opener, especially for people that are in the old Earth camp, just because you do really have to account for why everything isn't already extinct, if that's the case. I mean, I highly recommend both of you to just go and check out that book. You'll see what I'm talking about. The rate of decay and degradation on the genome is astronomical. And he was talking about just a mutation rate of just 0.1 having detrimental effects that we couldn't even fathom trying to uphold. And we have it of upwards of 60 to 100. So and this is per generation, by the way. So every single individual that's born is going to have at least 100 mutations, most of which are going to be deleterious or neutral in quotes. And those mutations, another 50 of that is going to be carried over to your offspring. And those mutations are often deleterious. They are deleting part of your genome every single time you have offspring. So if you imagine the number of generations we have so far, it's literally a miracle if we have been around for millions of years.
It's impossible. Right. It's impossible. The mutation accumulation problem puts shelf lives on genomes. And exactly what you were saying here, Brother Pigs, John, if you can share my screen. Here's a paper by Michael Lynch confirming what Pigs is saying. An average newborn contains 100 de novo mutations. And we know that the vast majority of our genome is actually functional. So this has been looked at. People like Kondrashov recognize that there is a massive problem when it comes to mutation accumulation, because most mutations are nearly neutral. They're invisible to selection. So they degenerate over time. And he noticed there was a huge problem, even if 10 of those were deleterious, because somebody like Kondrashov, he believes that only 10% of the genome is functional. Now we know at least 80% of the genome is functional. That means 80 of those new mutations, those 100 new mutations, are deleterious. That's detrimental to all species. It puts shelf lives on species. Species cannot go back any more than a couple hundred to a few hundred generations. That's actually a fatal blow to evolutionary theory. So good point, Pigs.
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, it also gets it gets worse, because so with the deleterious effects of the mutations, you have to imagine that we've seen a vast increase spike of various diseases. For cancers are way high up now, and I mean, these things are just popping up out of nowhere. These are not things that were in existence prior, right? That's the direct influence of these, this genetic degradation. If you just go back in time, you'll start to realize that the human genome was much stronger. That's why there were groups like the Spartans that existed that could go out and war,
right.
And they wouldn't have, I mean, they could survive for days, sometimes weeks without food. And that was just their lifestyle. But whereas, we most of us, probably some of it has to do with us being coddled. We live in like a very safe environment, nowadays, in some depending on where you live, of course. And that might also be contributing toward this degradation as well. But I don't know if you guys have ever heard, I know that Standing for Truth has heard of it, but the Richard Lenski experiment on E. coli,
Right.
basically the exact same thing happened in that, because they had these, the bacteria, the E. coli that they had cultured there was basically becoming pampered, right? It was like a pampered pooch version of the of E. coli, and it lost the ability to use its flagellum because they were on a centrifuge. It was just constantly shaking it around and feeding it, just free meals. And
Lenski's experiment is a prime example of reductive evolution. I mean, his bacterial populations, I think there's about
they
12
can't go
of
back.
them.
They can't go back to the normal
They're
life.
cornered. Yeah, they're painted into a corner, and they shrank in functional genome size. And here's the thing, Pigs, to back up what you're saying, is a lot of skeptics, and I debated, I had a discussion with Rob Rowe recently. I wouldn't call that much of a debate. He didn't have an answer to anything. And I pointed out that these aren't young Earth creationists that are coming up with this data. I mean, this is world famous population geneticists. To back up what you're saying, Pigs, Michael Lynch. He points out exactly what you're saying. The incidence of a variety of afflictions, including autism, male infertility, asthma, immune system disorders, diabetes, already exhibit increases exceeding the expected rate. Look at this. At least 30% of individuals with autism spectrum disorders appear to acquire such behaviors of de novo mutation. So the evolutionists, like Vector here, want to say that a fish evolved into a fisherman, or a bacteria-like organism evolved into a biologist through mutation accumulation, because they say mutations are the source for all genetic diversity, for all innovation and genetic variation. And yet what we see is mutations degrade, mutations destroy, mutations lead to disease and cancer. Okay, mutations are taking us downhill and not uphill. That's why evolutionary theory is a joke. It's a fairy tale. It has no evidence. Mutation accumulation has absolutely destroyed pond scum to people evolution.
Yeah, and I mean, and the odds of getting a single beneficial point mutation is like 1 in a million per individual mutation. And it's like that starts to become a lot exponential, in the sense that you aren't going to expect to see this across generations, right? So even if you get one beneficial mutation, what are the odds that you're going to pass that generational mutation to the next generation, right?
And what's funny about that is that's exactly, and this has all been looked at. Look at, there's paper after paper, thousands of artificial simulations through Mendel's accountant, which is the most sophisticated program that simulates the evolutionary processes of natural selection, mutation, so on and so forth. So they've looked at that. Can beneficials counterbalance the deleterious mutation accumulation? Nope. You can have 1, 2, heck, you can have 20 beneficial mutations. And Lenski's experiment has demonstrated that beneficial mutation rate is about 1 in a million. So it's far too rare. And typically those beneficial mutations are still reductive. They are the result of a broken cell, broken protein, as we see with sickle cell anemia.
Well,
so no, you can have a beneficial mutation. Heck, you can have 100 and they still cannot keep up with deleterious mutations. It's been looked at. It's been falsified.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The way that they the way that they define the term beneficial is actually in terms of whether or not you can have offspring sooner, basically. And a lot of times, not all the time, but most of the time, that's what it's been shown to be. So if like I said, with the Richard Lenski experiment, they were counting beneficial mutations as anything that allowed them to propagate their genetics quicker. And that was their version of a beneficial mutation. Now, that's, in terms of like removing things that they didn't need, that made it more efficient and easier for them to do those things, right? Based in a certain environment that they were in. The one that was able to digest citrate, again, that was something that they already had in their genome from the first gene, but it was not an expressed gene. It was in the epigenetics. And so when it was expressed, after they had lost their function of the flagellum, they ended up unable to turn off the gene. They can no longer go back in time and remove that gene if they ever go back into a normal living environment.
Right.
In other words, they would not survive outside of the citrate.
They're losing genes short term for adaptive purposes, but it's actually long-term degeneration. This backs up what John was saying. Alexei Kondrashov, he is not a young Earth creationist, okay? He's a world-famous population geneticist. He said in the average human genotype, over 100 genes are dysfunctional or altogether missing, and over 1,000 genes are substantially impaired. Does that make you feel pretty good about yourself? Look at this. A newborn human carries about 100 de novo mutations, okay? About 10% of which are substantially deleterious. So he's saying that a rate of 10 deleterious mutations out of those 100 is too much in the human population and in other populations. And yet we now know at least 80 of those are deleterious, which means evolution and evolutionary advancement is impossible. So the thing is, with vector, I'm hearing a lot of background noise, and I think it's
Hey Mario, I'm put you on mute. Whenever you want to come in, just unmute yourself. But we're hearing the background noise. I know you're at work.
Yeah, here's
Sorry,
the last point I'll make. Here's the last point I'll make, and to go along with what John was saying too. Okay, we see the data suggests we're losing genes, we're gaining more of a genetic load, we're losing the capacity for change. Okay, because we're going from more heterozygosity to less, where we have more homozygosity now. Point is, vector can't explain this data. Theistic evolutionists can't. Naturalistic evolutionists cannot. What this logically means is if we go back in time, that means we had a greater genetic potential for change. We had superior genomes, which explains why in the Bible we see that the early biblical patriarchs lived hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay, all of this suggests a downhill process and not an uphill process that's required if a fish evolved into a fisherman. So go ahead, I yield.
Okay, great point. I think this might illustrate how I can give you at least somewhat of a rebuttal to that. So we have to think of it in terms of the conditions that are causing the deleterious mutations. So what we're measuring now is based on, in our modern society where we have all these artificial inputs into the data, that into the organisms that can cause mutations. And, we artificially created one in that experiment you're talking about. But couldn't the theistic evolutionists just say that before the fall, there was a perfect synchronicity in creation, and so that those mutations weren't happening, and that you still use that process to get to the end result, and you still have Adam, you still have the fall.
Well, these mutations that are accumulating in human populations, they're not artificial. I mean, we are passing on 100 new genetic mistakes per person per generation. Pigs, I'll hand it to you, but I want to ask Vector a quick question that'll answer all of this. Vector, how do you explain the origin of genetic diversity and genetic variation? What's the source for genetic variation according to your model?
Yeah, that's the mystery. How did it's DNA, and we can talk about RNA or how it came about.
Well, no, it's not a mystery. I'm talking about for genetic change, allelic variability. What results in genetic diversity? What results in new genetic variation?
Yeah, well, I'll be honest with you, SOT. I was Young Earth for a while. I was a fan of Creation Research Institute when Henry Morris was heading it. And
well, can you just answer the question,
yeah.
Vector? I'll answer for it. It's mutation. No, stop. According to evolutionary knowledge, mutations, you're dodging, you're ducking, you're dipping, you're diving, you're dodging all over the place. So no, here's the thing. The evolutionary model proposes that mutations, this is just basic evolutionary theory, and you're jumping all over the place. They propose that mutations are the source for all new genetic variation, okay? But we now know that mutations are deleterious, they're damaging, they lead to disease. So the young Earth creation model, which suggests that the vast majority of DNA differences and DNA diversity is the result of what? Created and front-loaded genetic diversity, front-loaded heterozygosity. That makes the most sense of the data. So if those DNA differences and genetic variation is already built in, then change is easy. We don't need millions of years to add diversity through mutations, because we know mutations destroy. Your model's completely destroyed. I'm sorry, Vector.
Well, I mean, I understand your position. Like I was saying, I held it for a while.
You don't, because you don't even understand your own position. You didn't even know mutations were the source of genetic variation for the evolutionary model.
I understand the position. Actually, I do. I have a degree. I've taken biology classes. I understand.
So how do mutations take a fish to fisherman? How do mutations take a single-celled like ancestor into a whale if we know mutations destroy? Answer that question. Don't dodge. Answer that straightforward question. Go ahead.
Okay, and we'll see. In terms, if you're going to give a theistic evolution model, you're going to have to incorporate theology into your model. So I'm going to say that the Hebrew word yom did refer to an age or a long period of time. I'm going to say that God was acting, in the physical universe before consciousness as we know it, came onto the earth. The spirit was hovering over the waters, and so yeah, the mystery is how did DNA come into being? So that's the real question you're asking.
No. The real question is how.
I just explained it.
No. Evolutionary theory says that mutations result in genetic innovation. How's that possible? Go ahead. This guy doesn't answer any questions. So
hang on. Okay, calm down. All right. So, Vector, is it your position that God inserted all of the initial genomic information actively, or that it was derived via traditional evolutionary theory?
Yeah, well, you're going pre abiogenesis or post?
Any. I mean, you called yourself a theistic evolutionist, and to my knowledge, theistic evolutionists think that it was God had no action directly in it, and it was all like pre-programmed to happen from like physics and chemistry, which is ironic given the fact that we now know beyond doubt that physics and chemistry have absolutely nothing to do with why the genetic data is what it is. So that completely goes out the window. So you're now back to either it all happened through random mutation and natural selection, or it was created by an intelligent agent directly.
Correct.
That's where the options are. So are you either it was all somehow installed from God, like from the formation of the universe, or God took active action at some point, or it all came through random mutations and natural selection? Which is it?
Okay, we actually have three choices. We have, necessity, we have chance, and we have design, just like we do with in the beginning of the universe.
Okay, so, I literally just outlined all three of those options. So which one is your position?
My position is that through what I guess we could term supernatural means, God intervened, into the cosmic sphere during the process of the formation of the Earth and allowed the DNA code to form. Now, we could discuss what a stochastic process is and how it's possible. We could try to, we could talk about the.
Are you saying God only created the first self-replicating cell, or he created different kinds of animals?
I'm going to say that I have to remain agnostic as to the mysteries of God and how he created us.
But you're the one who's saying You're the one who's saying that chimpanzees and humans are related and this evolutionary process is scientific and valid, but you won't answer the simple question. So you're saying God initially created DNA. Okay, now you got to take whatever that first organism is, or whatever that first few organisms are, into the rest of life. Whales, pine trees, humans, chimpanzees, okay? Evolutionary theory says that mutations, natural selection acting upon random variation, that random variation being the result of mutations, is what leads to new innovation, okay? So my question to you then, and what John's asking, is do you hold to that, this idea that mutations add the genetic variation necessary for selection to act upon? Is that what you hold to?
It's a good question. It's actually, when I was looking at it without all the data that we have now from genetics, that's why I was a young Earth creationist, because I couldn't figure out how like the evolution of a bird's wing made sense on natural selection, how small incremental increases and Bernoulli's principle application to their body versus the negative impact of things like losing teeth and claws and being able to fight and transitioning into flight didn't make any sense to me. And actually, those questions I still feel like any type of evolutionary model isn't able to answer. So, you know, I agree with you on a certain level. I don't think we can definitively answer. That's why we have these debates. You know, you can actually support either position.
Well, no, you can't support evolutionary theory as you're proven, and as we have, I've proven that in 80 to 100 debates against some of the best evolutionists. Same with John. So here's the thing: no, mutations are destructive. We've pointed that out. Me and pigs, we accumulate new mutations every generation, and they're deleterious. Population geneticists that are evolutionists and secular are acknowledging this problem. They've come up with solutions. Those solutions have been looked at, analyzed, and falsified. There's yet no solution to the genetic degeneration problem. So the best explanation and the best hypothesis is the model that me and John hold to, which is the front-loaded capacity for change. That what we see in terms of the majority of genetic diversity was not the result of mutations. It was actually the result of design diversity. God front-loaded Adam and Eve and the created kinds with genetic variation that can then be used. It's already front-loaded, it's already built in, it's already pre-programmed into organisms. Now selection and recombination and gene conversion can act upon these design variants to lead to change. That's what we see in epigenetics. Epigenetics demonstrates forward thinking, which puts us back to a forward thinker. So no, mutations cannot account for the novelty that's necessary for large-scale evolution, and theistic evolution fails